Assalamualaikum and welcome to session 101, 101 of the Harborne Islamic Studies Circle, HISC, where we've been doing Seerah, and we've just finished our 13th session directly related to the Battle of Badr last time, and now we're going to do, as I say, a couple of other incidents before the Battle of Uhud. And last week, again, just very quick recap, was sort of the second half of the lessons and consequences of Badr, and we talked about the need for people to be serious about their deen, not to be part-time Muslims, how, and we'll see some of this later on today, how cowards can hide behind misinformation, and the fact that Allah was the one who forced the encounter on the day of Badr. The fact that Allah listens to the du'as of all people, so be careful of what you ask for and how you treat other people, because they will be making du'a to Allah as well. And we talked very briefly about the etiquette of du'a, talk about the dangers of pride, arrogance and anger, and this is what some of the things that got the mushrikeen killed, some of the legal lessons from the Battle of Badr, which include how to deal with the shaheed, the burial of the shaheed, etc., prisoners of war, spoils of war, and some of the battlefield etiquette. And again, we'll deal with a couple of those things today as well, and how Allah had been preparing the Muslims, by changing the Qibla, by introducing zakat, and making people ready for the struggles of the battle. Some of the consequences and effects of the battle, it changed the life of the world, essentially. Now Islam was seen as a functional political reality with a unified leadership, and the Muslims had a legitimate presence. And the people of Medina, they were happy, they were full of pride and self-confidence. In the Prophet ﷺ, they had a complete ruler with military backing. They were able to celebrate the first Eid properly. Also, the Muslims got to know of the status of the shaheed and those that died in Badr. And this was the first battle that the Ansar actually took part in, because their mandate, the pledge, had been defensive. And now we've got an additional source of income for the Muslims, and they were able to fully realize the economic vulnerability and military vulnerability of Makkah and the Quraysh. However, we also saw the creation of nifaq, hypocrisy, and internal treachery within Medina, and we'll talk about that again, inshallah, today, in terms of not the munafiqeen, but in terms of Bani Israel, the Jewish tribes. The people in Makkah, they became obviously very demoralized, utter state of shock, disbelief, and there's a collective amnesia around the things that led up to Badr. And there was a crisis in their political realm, in their leadership. There's a social crisis because every household was affected, and there's an economic crisis because their trade was now vulnerable, and they are a society built upon trade. And the Arab tribes who weren't involved, they now had to either switch allegiance, or they needed to be clear: are they on the sides of the Prophet ﷺ or on the side of the Quraysh still? And just generally now, this was the culmination of the dawah and the justification of the emigration, the sacrifices of the Muhajir. This has reinforced the fact that now, more than ever, Medina is their fully fledged home for good. We then talk briefly about this, a very minor incident that happened. We briefly mentioned it or touched upon it before. News came to the Prophet ﷺ that the Banu Saleem from the Ghatafan tribe, they were gathering their troops to launch a preemptive strike against the people of Medina, against the Muslims in Medina, because they'd seen the fact that the Muslims had been victorious, but there were very few of them, and they thought this was a good time to attack. The Muslims will be off guard, so they started mustering up their troops. Prophet ﷺ obviously had advanced intelligence. He he had people bringing him this information. So a scouting body from Medina were able to tip the Prophet off. So rather than wait for the invasion, the Prophet he then launched a surprise attack. Took his troops, mounted a surprise attack on Banu Saleem, and he invaded their homeland, got to a place, a watering place called Al-Qudr, and before Banu Saleem could actually gather themselves properly, they fled before the Prophet arrived. When they realized he was now coming to attack them, they fled, and the Prophet, like he did in Badr, he camped there for 3 days, and the Banu Saleem, they'd left everything. They just went up and left, and there was a huge booty which included 500 camels, etc., etc. And the Prophet he distributed that amongst the fighters, and obviously there's a fifth that was kept, and we talked about the categories before. So this, as I say, this was just within a few weeks of the Battle of Badr in early Shawwal. Excuse me. So the next thing to talk about is Banu Qaynuqa, and these were a big Jewish tribe who lived in sort of the central parts of Medina, and they were blacksmiths and goldsmiths, and they were sort of very influential tribe. They had strong allegiance with the Khazraj, and they were not happy with the Muslims and the fact that the Prophet ﷺ had defeated the Quraysh. And we'll come on to that in a second. But before talking about what happened with Banu Qaynuqa, there's an issue that comes up because there are three main tribes, Jewish tribes, Banu Qaynuqa, Banu Nadir, and Banu Qurayza, and then obviously there's Khaybar much later on. But these three were those who were in or around Medina, and the Prophet ﷺ, he dealt with all three of them in a separate, distinct ways, and we'll talk about that later on. But there are accusations of people who, haters are going to hate. They're going to look at these things and they're going to draw incorrect conclusions to try to smear the Muslims and the Prophet ﷺ and early Islam, and to paint Islam as being what we would now call anti-Semitic, or and try to talk about how the Prophet ﷺ, he hated the Jews, etc., etc., and this was just part of his plan. But so it's important to put things into context, and the Prophet ﷺ, straight out, never ever discriminated against the Jews for them being Jewish. That was not part of what the Prophet ﷺ did. It's not part of Islam. It's not part of Islamic history. The Muslim history, up until sort of the last, just about 100 years or so, the Muslims and the Jewish people have always lived peacefully, generally, in coexistence together. And in fact, Islam is a place of refuge throughout history for the Jewish people, and it's only been sort of since the creation of the state in Palestine of Israel, 1947, I think, and the few decades leading up to that, where you had mass migration into Palestine, that there's been a problem between Muslims and the Jewish people. Before that, this concept of anti-Semitism or hatred of the Jews, it's not part of the Muslim DNA. It's not part of our history. We've had Muslims and Jews live peacefully for centuries. In fact, the golden era of Jewish literature and law is during Islamic rule, and it's well documented. I mean, you've got there's some really famous Jewish thinkers. I mean, the most famous is Moses Maimonides, or Musab bin Maimun. He is born in Cordoba. He was a philosopher in Morocco and ended up in Egypt and became a Rambam, or the chief grand rabbi of Egypt. And he's the one who codified Jewish law, Talmudic law. He wrote in Arabic because that was the lingua franca of progress. And he's known as the Great Eagle of the Jews. I mean, he really, as I say, codified Jewish law, Talmudic law. And there's other great thinkers like Rabbi Sadia bin Yusuf Gaon. Again, he lived in Baghdad and under the Abbasids, and he's known for his works on Jewish philosophy and other things. So you've got really famous, Jewish polymaths, who lived under Islam. Whenever there would be persecution, like in Andalusia or in Russia or other parts of Europe, the Jews would always go to the Muslim lands. They were invited, they were actually welcomed. The Sultan or the Khalif would oftentimes send ships to the place where the Jewish people are being persecuted and say, look, they don't want you, come live with us. And that's why you got pockets of Jewish people living in places like Morocco, in Yemen. There's even, it's documented that there's a sector within Constantinople, Istanbul, where the Jewish people there, they speak a Andalusian dialect of Hebrew, because they're the ones who were brought, specifically during the Uthmani Khilafah from there into Istanbul. So there's a rich history of coexistence, right? And even by definition, a Semite is a descendant of Ibrahim alayhi salam. The Arabs and the Jews are descendants of Abraham. So even by definition, the Arabs and the Prophet cannot be, an anti-Semite. So this thing. So as I say, Muslims and Jews generally have lived, in peace throughout Muslim rule. Anti-Semitism is actually a byproduct of European nationalism. And through this European nationalism, you get the rise of anti-Semitism, and they're looking for people to blame. It's people who look different, people who dress different, it's people who talk different, like what we're seeing today. And in those days, the easy target were the Jews, and so the Europeans would come up with crazy conspiracy theories around wealth and power, right, in order to justify persecution of the Jewish people. And they have been persecuted, and no doubt about that. And obviously that culminated in the way Hitler would persecute the Jews for being Jewish people, right? So there has been persecution of the Jewish people, but that has generally been by the Europeans or descendants of the Europeans, because of the mindset that they're looking for other people to blame. And even now, because of that sensitivity around the Holocaust or World War II and how the Jewish people were treated, there is this uber sensitivity, and you see that currently in the UK with the Labour Party and issues that they're having around anti-Semitism. Even in America, the USA Congress, you've got people being oversensitive around criticism. France and Germany, obviously, because of their history with the Second World War, they are oversensitive to criticism of anything which is Jewish, and so there's a false equation between anti-Semitism and what we know as Zionism or anti-Zionism. So Zionism is a nationalist, some would say a racist, secular movement that was set up to provide a homeland for purely the Jewish people, and they took the inhabited land of Palestine, and there were Jews, Christians and Muslims there by force, and they set up their own land, and they discriminate against other people. So that's the philosophy of Zionism. So you have, as Zionists, you can have, obviously Jews can be Zionists, you have nowadays Christian Zionists, Hindu Zionists, for different political reasons. And you have people who work against Zionism, from all walks of life, including many Jewish people, even including many people living in the current state of Israel. They are against Zionism because they see it for what it was set up as a racist, nationalist, secular movement for the Jewish people. And even, I mean, it's a lot, well known in the history books around. Even when the Balfour Declaration or the British mandate in Palestine, a lot of prominent Jewish people were against Zionism because they saw it as undermining Jewishness. And even now, you've got a lot of Jewish people, religious Jewish people, who are against Zionism. So, now we have the rise of the BDS movement, or people who criticize the far-right extremist policies of the current Israeli government. And people want to sort of mix the two, that criticism of that is the same as being anti-Semitic. But going back to the starting point, Islam is not anti-Semitic. Islam actually it always treats people with respect, especially the people of the book. Islam has always been a home for the Jewish people. During the Islamic rule, the Jewish people were known as Ehle Dhimma, the people of contract. They, have their own rulings and their own internal affairs to do with their religion, etc. So the Muslims and Islam has always respected the Jewish people. Islam, is in fact the only solution to get rid of racism, right? Islam is against these, forms of prejudice, whether it's, criticizing or treating people different because of their race, because of the color of their skin, because of the city or nation of birth, because of their tribe, their wealth, their family pedigree. These are not reasons to prejudice people positively or negatively, right? People should be judged according to their taqwa, their God consciousness, their closeness to Allah, their knowledge of Islam. Just generally, these are the important things. These are the important values in society. We don't discriminate, or generally we don't discriminate people according to the color of their hair, or we don't discriminate people, according to sort of other attributes that they have. So discriminating people because of their race, their color, their birth, these forms of prejudice are wrong, and Islam has always been against these things. Okay, so that's the starter for 10, and it's important to say that, especially in this climate, when we're talking about what happened to Banu Qaynuqa, and then obviously the examples with the other tribes like Banu Qurayza and Banu Nadir, and obviously after the Ghazwat al-Ahzab, obviously there was a very different ruling around what happened to the tribe there. So going back after that prelude, and it's always important to state that so things don't get taken out of context. We've talked before the fact that Bani Israel, the Hebrews, the Jewish tribes, they'd migrated generally from Syria, some from Abyssinia to the Arab Peninsula, and they'd settled in various places in Khaybar, but also in Medina for various reasons. Okay, and the people. One of the theories, obviously, is that they were waiting for the Messiah. They were waiting for the Prophet ﷺ, and they maintained their ethnic particularism. They detached themselves from integrating within the Arab population. They would live in forts. They wouldn't. There would be some, Jewish Arab weddings, but they were few and far between. It wasn't the norm, it was the exception. And they used to, and we talked about it before, they used to pride themselves in their Jewish origin, and they looked down upon the Arabs, and they sort of called them illiterate, and that was like a a derogatory term, meaning they're brutal, naive, backward people, much like people label Muslims today in various ways. So the Jewish people, they looked down upon the Arabs, and they thought of themselves as being superior. They were obviously wealthy. They were known as the goldsmiths. They used to lend money as well, and they would, take, if people weren't able to pay back things, as in many usury contacts, they would have to forfeit, and often they would take either family members, being held in as collateral, so children, boys or girls, or they would take as collateral their land and take their wealth if people defaulted on payment. So there was some tension between the different tribes, and Allah refers to some of this, and in the Qur'an He says, because they say there is no blame on us to betray and take the property of the illiterates, as in the Arabs, and some of their social practices, despite being people of the book, they involved themselves in things like fortune telling, witchcraft, blowing on the knots, that type of thing. So they were expert money traders at the time. They as we talked about, dealt in usury or interest. But another thing that they would do, although Banu Qaynuqa were allies of the Khazraj, and Banu Nadir and Banu Qurayza were allies to the Aus, the Jewish tribes would try to pit off the Arabs against each other, not just Al-Aus and the Khazraj, but even within themselves. And there's documented evidences of them trying to, corrupt the tribal bonds even before Islam. And so they were sort of adept in the art of divide and rule. So when the Prophet ﷺ came, this was obviously a big shock for them, because he was not ethnically a Jew, even though it's clear in their own books that he will be an Arab. But this was still a big shock for the Jewish tribes, and purely on that fact, much like the Quraysh, purely on the fact that the Prophet ﷺ was who he was, they refused to follow him. They knew he came with the truth. They knew he was a prophet of Allah, messenger of Allah. They knew that, but through pride and arrogance of tribal bonds and other social bonds, and losing their status, they refused to reconcile with that and refused to follow the Prophet ﷺ, apart from a few, right? And they had visceral hatred towards the Prophet ﷺ, many of them, and towards Islam, and they would do things purely just to undermine the Prophet ﷺ. And we see that in a few stories about how they interacted with the Prophet ﷺ. And one of the earliest things which we didn't talk about when the Prophet ﷺ, we may have hinted to, but we didn't actually explicitly talk about, when the Prophet ﷺ first did the hijrah and he came to Yathrib, or Medina, as it became known, and he camped outside Medina in Quba, and obviously he built the first mosque there, and he was waiting for Ali and the others to come back. So when he's there, we've got a narration from Safiya, who is one of the mother of the believers. The Prophet ﷺ married her much later on, and in Ibn Ishaq, Safiya, she's the daughter of a very prominent Jewish elder called Huyay bin Akhtab, and he'll crop up a couple of times in the Seerah. So Huyay bin Akhtab, his favourite daughter was Safiya, and she was really young, maybe 6 or 7. And she clearly remembers, because this was a traumatic experience for her. She said, "Look, I used to be the closest the closest child to my father and to my uncle Abi Yasir, Okay, they adored Sophia. So whenever they saw me with a child of theirs, they would pamper me so tenderly to the exclusion of anyone else. Okay, so she was really spoiled, and they loved her. They really loved her, and she knew that, and she played on that. And she goes, however, when the Prophet ﷺ came and settled in Quba with Bani Amr ibn Auf, my father Huyay bin Akhtab and my uncle Abu Yasir bin Akhtab, they went to see him, and they didn't come back until sunset. And when they came, and she recalls this, even being a young girl, she recalls this, and when they came back walking lazily and fully dejected. So as a young girl who's always pampered by these, she says, as usual, I hurried to meet them, smiling and bouncing, but they wouldn't turn for me. And she could see that they were grief-stricken. So then, this was a traumatic experience for a young child. And then she said, look, I heard my uncle Abu Yasir saying to Ubay and Huyay, is it really him, as in Muhammad? So Abu Yasir says, is it really him? And Huyay said, it is he. I swear by Allah. He goes, are you sure? Do you recognize him? And they said, yes. We know this is him that has been mentioned in our books. And then they were asked, so how will you deal with him? And then he said, I will oppose him till the end of my days. My heart is burning with hatred towards him. So, and again, these words are seared into the memory of this young child, right? They recognize that this is the Prophet, the one that they've been waiting for. But the fact that he is an Arab, they just could not take that. This was just a step too far. And then there's the evils of tribalism, of nationalism, and we see that in the current political climate, right? These bonds are so primitive and evil, right? And purely on that basis, they're opposing the truth, the haqq, right? Excuse me. So you got an example there of how they would treat the Prophet ﷺ. And again, we talked previously about Abdullah ibn Salam, who was the sort of chief rabbi, again at the same meeting, he accepted the Prophet ﷺ. He asked him a few questions, had a chat, and he accepted Islam. And then he told the Prophet ﷺ, don't tell them I've converted, wait till you hear their testimony about me, and then tell them I've converted. And when the Prophet ﷺ did that, then he could see how they flipped their testimony, and then said, that Abdullah bin Salam, he is the worst of them, and the son of the worst of them, was before they said he's the best of us. So again, these are the first experiences the Prophet ﷺ had with the Jewish tribe, and he was in honest expectation that they would be following him and they would be his strongest supporters. He honestly believed that when he entered into Medina, when he wrote the constitution, when he made the obligations. He honestly believed that it's going to be a short matter of time, and they will start to follow, and they will see the truth because they are educated people of the book. But then the Battle of Badr happened, and that really blew things open. This historic victory, acknowledged by everyone, the Jews, the Arabs, the Quraysh. This was a heavy blow to the the Mushrikeen. Okay, so this Muslim Islamic victory gave a delta blow to the Jewish religio-economic identity and entity. So this great victory that Muslims had, this really burned the hearts of the hypocrites, the Jews and the Arab hypocrites. And Allah refers to this in Surah Al-Ma'idah, verily you will find the strongest amongst men in enmity towards the believers are the Jews and the Mushrikeen. Okay? So, and obviously you've got Abdullah ibn Ubai, which we'll talk more about, certainly around the Battle of Uhud, about how he acted. But soon after, within a few moments, a few days of the victory, things in Banu Qaynuqa, they came to a head. But again, we don't have too much information around the actual examples of how they were troublemaking, sowing the seeds of discontent. I mean, some of the tactics we know, because one of them is well documented in the books of Seerah, and that's someone called Shas bin Qais. He was an elderly Jewish person, and he was obviously he hated Islam. He was very envious of the Muslims, and especially the fact that the Aus and the Khazraj, they'd joined together and they had shed their tribal allegiances, and they had this strong bond of brotherhood. So he then asked one of a youth that he had influence over to go sit amongst the Aus and the Khazraj, who were the Ansar, and remind them the stories of the Bu'ath war, and then incite them by some of the poetry that they used to recite, on each side around the time of the Badr war, where they used to criticize the Aus and the Khazraj, respectively or disrespectively, and see how they would sow the seeds of discontent. So he wanted the old tribal sense and prejudices to come out in this tribal fanaticism, and so Shas bin Qais, he sent his chap, and it worked. He's there, pitting one off the other. Remember how you guys used to say, and remember you guys used to say this, and and sort of their tribal bonds then came up, and they were actually going to fight amongst each other, and there was going to be a brawl, and they were really angry. Somebody ran to the Prophet ﷺ, who came galloping down, and then he chastised them and said, "Oh, Muslims, do you still advance your Jahiliyyah arguments after I have been sent to you as a messenger? Remember that it is not rightful for you to turn back after Allah has guided you to the straight path and delivered you from disbelief and created love and friendship between you." And so the Muslims realized their errors, and they became more vigilant of the plots hatched by the enemies to sow discontent between them. But again, this has been brewing along for a long time, because even from an economic term, Banu Qaynuqa, they had the main souk, which was closer to sort of the central Yathrib. But when the Prophet ﷺ, he came and he saw the practices of Banu Qaynuqa, one of the first things, and we talked about this, was he set up an independent economic transactional forum for the Muslims. He set up their own souk, okay, and then he legislated how they do business in their souk. So the Banu Qaynuqa, they saw that business was going directly from them, away from them, to the Muslim souk now, and this hurt them. So it was in their interest to troublemaker, to try to sow dissension, to propagate falsehood and fabrication, fake news stories, right? To try and whip up these things amongst the early Muslims, and it doesn't go unnoticed. And the Prophet ﷺ, he's got very good intel. So these things go back to the Prophet ﷺ. And other stories, like for example, if some of the Banu Qaynuqa, they happen to owe something to the Muslims, when the people became Muslim, they said, "Look, you've converted to a new religion. Our old agreement is no longer valid. I'm going to keep it." Okay. But if it was the other way around, they would continue to harass these people until they got paid. They didn't say, "Now you've become a Muslim, we forgive you of your debt." Okay. So these things were carrying on, and intel was getting to the Prophet that actually these guys are are like a fifth column. They are trying to undermine unity and discord. And especially after the Battle of Badr, they went into overdrive into their propaganda to say, look, this is wrong, blah, 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 blah. So much so that the Prophet ﷺ, after the Battle of Badr, he had to go with his entourage to Banu Qaynuqa. He gathered all of the elders and the people of Banu Qaynuqa as the ruler in chief. And he gathered them all, and he basically told them off and said, look, stop what you're doing. This is wrong. You made an agreement. We need to live in peace. Be rational, be sensible, right? You don't want to cause problems. So roll back from your hatred and your enmity. This is not, this goes against, what you signed up for. And he's giving them. He's not giving them the right act. He's just reminding them of their obligation. Say, look, change your ways. Look what happened to the Quraysh. So, you need to calm down. And then, and this shows that their hatred. One of the elders, it's not documented who, he stood up. And again, it's important the fact that not just what he said, but the reaction of people. So he stood up in front of everybody, in front of the Prophet, and said, Muhammad, don't be fooled or deluded on account of defeating the Quraysh, because these people are inexperienced in warfare. No one knows who they are. The Quraysh, they've never really fought. They're a bunch of nobodies. Okay, if you were to engage in warfare with us, you will realize, that who real men are. We are the genuine experts in war. We know how to fight. And this is clearly, blatantly, in your face, a challenge to the Prophet ﷺ and to his authority. And they reached that level of hatred that they were able to say this publicly. And importantly, and again, this is a recurrent theme, and again, this is a lesson for us, nobody rebuked this person. If we found a situation where other people say, look, what you're talking is rubbish, yes, we're going to listen to what Prophet ﷺ said, we'll sort these things out, we'll mediate or whatever, don't worry, but nobody rebuked the elder. And again, we see that even in our own community today, people clearly do wrong, yet people don't rebuke them, for fear or for loss of patronage or whatever. They become complicit. So here you've got the whole community being complicit with this challenge of the Prophet's authority, and where they say, look, you didn't fight real men. You're going to fight us. You will know what battle is. Okay, so that sends a message of how their mindset. Okay, again, Allah refers not necessarily to this example, but this attitude in Surah Al-Ma'idah, Surah Al-Imran, verses 12 and 13, where he says, say, O Muhammad, to the disbelievers, you will be defeated and gathered together to hell, and the worst indeed is that the place to rest. There has already been a sign for you, O Jews, in the two armies that met in combat, i.e. in the Battle of Badr. One was fighting in the cause of Allah, and as for the other, they were disbelievers. They, the believers, saw them, the believers, with their own eyes twice their number, although they were thrice their number, and Allah supports with His victory whom He pleases. Verily, in this is a lesson for those who understand. So again, Surah Al-Imran, one of the early Medina surahs, Allah saying to the Jewish people, look, take heed from the Battle of Badr, right? But they didn't, and this answer from the tribal leaders of Banu Qaynuqa was essentially like a declaration of war, right? So the Prophet ﷺ, he suppressed his anger, and he advised the Muslims to be patient and forbearing and wait for what time might reveal. Essentially, give these people enough rope, they will expose themselves. Again, it's a very important lesson. So then sort of the tipping point came, the trigger point came when not soon after that, and we're talking within a few days of the Battle of Badr, within a week or two, there was a Muslim lady who went, she'd done some trade, and then she went to one of the goldsmiths in the souk of Banu Qaynuqa. And she was there doing business and buying, and then the goldsmith was sort of just playing with her as business people do. And then because she was covered up, this is obviously before hijab had been obligated, but in her modesty, going into the souk of Banu Qaynuqa, she had covered herself up. So this Jewish goldsmith was encouraging her to show your hair, let's see your face, I mean, going beyond flirting. And then he made, and she was obviously refusing. She was just there to do business. So he made a signal to someone, one of his other people, who came, and it said from the back, he sort of pinned her dress in such a way, and without her knowing, that when she stood up, she became exposed. All her lower portion was completely exposed. So as she's done the business, she stands up to go back, and she's fully exposed down below, So she just screams out, and she screams and says, "Oh, look what's happened! Somebody defend me!" And she's just screaming, And there's a Muslim chap who's in the souk nearby. He sees what's happened, and so he takes his sword and he chops the head off the guy who'd done this. But they're in the souk of Banu Qaynuqa, and then he's chopped the head off of one of the Jewish guys. So they pounce on him and they kill him. So news then goes back to the Prophet ﷺ that this is what's happened, that they dishonored a Muslim woman like this, and then the Muslim in retaliation killed them, and then he got killed. So then the Prophet ﷺ, the first thing he does is he sends word to Banu Qaynuqa, and he basically says, look, the treaty is broken, the treaty is annulled. Okay? And the Prophet ﷺ, he's referring back to the verse of Surah Al-Anfal, where Allah explicitly, because obviously Allah knows this is going to happen, Allah explicitly gives the Prophet ﷺ a code of conduct. Basically, in verse 58, we talked about this. If you have reason to fear from a people of betrayal, throw their treaty back at them, putting you on equal terms. Indeed, Allah does not like traitors. I mean, it's not like when kids play Risk and other board games, where it gets to the beginning of your go, and then you suddenly announce, well, I've broken my treaty with you, and I'm going to attack you. You're not allowed to do that, in Islam. You have a treaty with someone, you need to tell them, give them advanced, reasonable notice that the treaty is now annulled. I'm no longer obligated by the treaty. You can do what you like, and we will do what we like. It's not a surprise, traitorous action where you suddenly say, "Da-da, the treaty is now broken, I'm going to attack you." You can't do that. The Muslim is not like that. So Allah mentions that in Surah Al-Anfal. So the Prophet ﷺ, he sends word, okay, the treaty, the constitution that we signed at the beginning, we've annulled that. So I'm putting you on notice. So Banu Qaynuqa, they didn't think much of this. They didn't think the Prophet ﷺ was going to do anything specific. So they just carried on as they were. But then the Prophet ﷺ, within a few days, he marched out with his soldiers, with Hamza bin Abdul Muttalib carrying the standard of the Muslims, and they laid siege to Banu Qaynuqa, the forts of Banu Qaynuqa, and it said for 15 days. So it said at the end, I think there's some discrepancy whether the beginning of the siege was the 15th of Shawwal or the end of the siege was the 15th of Shawwal. But anyway, or when they marched out, the Muslims laid siege for over 2 weeks. And this is, again, this within a few weeks, this is within a month of the Battle of Badr. And Allah cast fear into the hearts of Banu Qaynuqa, and they weren't prepared for it. They hadn't stockpiled their food or their water. Things were running out. Things were getting separate. So then they sent word to the Prophet ﷺ that they will surrender. So as they're surrendering, they sort of surrendered the menfolk, and the Prophet ﷺ then he gave word to bound all the men. Okay, 700 of their fighters. That's how big the tribe was. So probably there are about 2,000 or so in totality, Banu Qaynuqa. But of fighting people, there were 300 well-armed men, 400 unarmed men. So there were 700. So they were all bound up, and they didn't know their fate, obviously, because they'd surrendered. But they had two chief allies that they had amongst the Khazraj. There was Abdullah ibn Ubai al-Salul and Ubadah ibn Samit. So then they sent emissaries to say, look, can you negotiate on our behalf, to Abdullah ibn Ubai and Ubadah ibn Samit. Then what happened is that Ubadah ibn Samit, he went straight to the Prophet ﷺ and said, look, I am renouncing my allegiance with Banu Qaynuqa. I'm no longer their khulafa. I'm no longer obligated to sort of negotiate with them. My wali is Allah and His Messenger, and I've formally cut off all ties. I have nothing to do with Banu Qaynuqa. My allegiance is with Allah and His Messenger. So this prominent position of leadership, I'm disowning that. So that's Ubadah bin Samit. In contrast that with Abdullah ibn Ubai, who again, he's an equivalent person to Ubadah bin Samit. He sees what's happening. He storms to the Banu Qaynuqa, sees them all tied up, and then he demands that the Muslims release him on his say-so. Right? So he goes, do it. Untie all these people. Do it now. And the Sahabi in charge, Al-Munzir, said no. He goes, do it or I will do it. Abdullah ibn Ubai, and he was, after the Battle of Badr, the chief most of the Khazraj and of the people of Yathrib. He was going to be king, so he felt he had this authority, despite Prophet being in charge. He goes, he ordered them to be set free, and Al-Munzir says no. He goes, look, I'm going to do it. And then Al-Munzir said, look, if you dare do that, I will kill you. And this is a shock to Abdullah ibn Ubai. Right? Somebody is not just disobeying his orders, saying, look, if you try untying them, I'm going to kill you. Because this is an order of the Prophet ﷺ. So then he storms over to where the Prophet ﷺ is, and then he sort of goes there and he says, Ya Muhammad, and the Allah has forbidden the Muslims to call the Prophet ﷺ, as they call each other. You will always find in the books of Seerah, they will say, O Messenger of Allah, right? O Prophet of Allah, okay? They never, and they're not allowed to say, O Muhammad, okay? But Abdullah ibn Ubai, he doesn't want to stoop that low. He's saying, Ya Muhammad, okay? Be generous with my allies. And the Prophet ﷺ, he was silent. As Abdullah ibn Ubai said, Ya Muhammad, be generous with my allies. And the Prophet ﷺ, didn't say anything. Oh Muhammad, be generous with my... And the third time, he actually grabbed the armor, put his own, hand, onto the arm of the Prophet ﷺ and said, be generous with my allies. And the Prophet ﷺ said, look, let go of me. What are you doing? Let go of me. And the Prophet ﷺ, he had anger on his face. And he's saying to him, can't believe what's happening here. This is, this is so disrespectful to the Prophet ﷺ. Somebody would, storm and demand stuff like this, calling him Muhammad, and said, look, and then grabbing his hand, and then he held on tight to the arm of the Prophet and said, I swear by Allah, I will not let you go until you promise you will treat my Hunafa, my allies, in a generous manner. These 700 people, 300 armed, 400 not armed, they protected me from the black and the white. And now you're going to get rid of them in one day? So he's based, and he says, look, I am scared of al-dawail, right? Bad luck. So he's just laying his cards on the table. Look, these guys, I've got strong business ties with them. They protected me through thick and thin, right? They defended me from the black and the white, from the red, and an expression saying, look, they helped me get to where I am. They made me rich, They are, and if you do anything against them, I'm afraid of bad luck, because these are my allies, right? And there's no reference there to Allah, right? So he's grabbing hold of them, and he's vowed by Allah, I'm not going to let you go until you treat them in a generous manner. So the Prophet, he's sort of shocked by this, sees the weak iman of Abdullah ibn Ubai, and to get rid of him, he says, fine, I give them to you. That's it. And we don't know, but this is before the Prophet had actually, given a hukam of what was going to happen. So we actually don't know what he was planning. He may have been planning to exile them anyway, but he said, look, I give them to you, right? So Abdullah ibn Ubai, he said, fine, we will spare their lives. But the Prophet says, right, they've done what they've done. They have 3 days to pack their bags and leave. Whatever they can take with them, that's it. Okay? So the Banu Qaynuqa, they went and they pleaded with Ubadah bin Samit. Said, look, can you give us more time? Can you reason with the Prophet ﷺ? And Ubadah bin Samit said, look, if it was up to me, I wouldn't have even given you 1 day to pack and go. I'm not going to go against what the Prophet ﷺ has said. And then they went back to Abdullah bin Ubai and said, look, can you try and argue on our behalf once things have calmed down a bit? And again, this just shows the tenacity of Abdullah ibn Ubai, his arrogance. He went and he tried to convince the Prophet to remove the ban, let them stay, right? Remove the ban, let them stay. And Prophet he's given his verdict. He's not going to go back on that. They've got 3 days, that's it. Okay? And then, on the basis of this, Allah again reveals in Surah Al-Ma'idah, and very important verses, 51 to 56, O you who believe, do not take the Jews and the Christians as your awliya, as your allies, as your protectors. Do not take them as your awliya. They are in fact awliya of one another, allies of one another. And whoever is an ally to them amongst you, then indeed he is one of them. Indeed, Allah does not guide the wrongdoing people. So what we'll do, that we'll finish it there actually, where I was talking about the awliya, not taking the Jews and Christians as awliya. The Bani Qaynuqa were exiled, and then we'll go through those verses in more detail next time, and we'll talk about how Allah praises Ubadah bin Samit, and he actually uses the same phrase that Abdullah ibn Ubai used and turned it against him. So again, I don't give you guys any homework anymore, but just read those verses with the Ma'idah, verses 51 to 56, and we'll pick up next week, inshallah, from there, and we'll talk about some of the benefits of expelling Banu Qaynuqa. So again, thank you very much. Again, just to reiterate the points, these actions against Banu Qaynuqa were not because they were Jewish, not because they were the Jewish tribes for the fact that they were Jewish. It's because they had reneged on their agreement. It's because they plotted and planned against the Prophet ﷺ. They tried to undermine, and they, in fact, were very in your face against the authority and rule of the Prophet ﷺ. So this was a necessary action against people who were being very disrespectful. Okay, so there's no hint of anti-Semitism here. There's no hint of targeting them because they are Jewish. It's targeting them because of their actions and their breaking of the contract and their outright hostility to the Muslims and the Prophet ﷺ. So we'll finish there, and we'll obviously revisit that, the end of that in the next session, inshallah. And again, there's another important story that needs to be taken in this context of the assassination of Qab. Again, we'll talk about that maybe next time, inshallah. So until then, do remember us in your du'as. Do subscribe to the YouTube channel, the Study Circle channel. Do remember the Ummah in your du'as. And until next time, take care. We'll finish again, as we always do, with Surah Al-Asr. والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. جزاك الله خير, everybody. Assalamu alaikum.